Hey, second period life science class. This is Miss Butler. Hope you enjoyed your long weekend. This week we're studying Chapter 10, Plant Processes and Reproduction. So last week we talked about seedless plants and seed plants. Seedless plants were like your mosses and your liverworts. Seed plants are the plants that you're really familiar with. Apple trees, cherry trees, magnolias, pine trees. So seedless plants don't have seeds, so they reproduce with spores. You're not going to see any flowers on them. And remember, they don't have vascular tissue, so that means they grow really short. Seed plants, that's most plants. Some have flowers, but remember, some have cones. So the flowers help make seeds by making fruit. But if you have a plant that is reproducing with cones, the seeds will actually be in the cone. Each seed has tissues that surround and protect the baby plant embryo that's inside the seed. So plant reproduction is what you're talking about this week. They can reproduce with one parent, asexually, or two parents, sexually, or even both. Asexual reproduction is when a portion of a plant turns into a separate new plant. Strawberries reproduce this way. The new plant is genetically the same as the parent plant. Sexual reproduction needs two parents. And so plants have sperm cells that combine with egg cells. And the result is a zygote, which is a fertilized egg, and that will grow into a plant. Let's talk about reproduction in seedless plants. Again, that's like your mosses, your liverworts, your ferns. They grow from spores that are made, and then they go through a sexual reproduction phase where they can make both eggs and sperm, and fertilization can take place. So they kind of do this thing called alteration of generations, where one generation grows from spores, and then the next generation grows from egg and sperm. Seed plants have pollen. I know you've seen that yellow hazy cloud recently. That's pollen from the trees that are growing in your neighborhood. Each yellow pollen grain has nutrients and a hard outer covering. Pollen grains actually contain the sperm cells of the plant that they come from. Large amounts of pollen, which is why you see those green and yellow clouds in the sky, or your car gets covered with that yellow film. That's large amounts of pollen that are produced by the male reproductive structures in a plant. Wind carries pollen, animals can carry pollen, even gravity and water can carry pollen. Pollination happens when the male pollen lands on a female reproductive structure of a plant that's the same species. The ovule is the female reproductive structure of a seed plant where the egg develops. So after pollination, the pollen, the sperm cells, enter the ovule and fertilization occurs, and a zygote forms and develops into an embryo plant. An embryo is an immature plant that develops from the zygote. A seed is an embryo. It's also got a food supply and a protective covering, like this picture here. So in this cross-section of corn, all of this is the food supply. It's got a protective covering, and the baby plant is right down here in the side. That's called the embryo. This is like a bean or a peanut. If you've ever cracked open a peanut, what you're eating is the food supply for the baby plant. The baby plant is that little bit that's in the corner. Reproduction in flowerless seed plants like gymnosperms. Remember you studied these last week? These are the cone producers. The most common gymnosperms are pines, firs, redwoods. They have leaves that are like needles, and they usually stay green all year long. They do the same thing. There's a male cone with pollen and a female cone that's got the ovules. So when pollination happens, the male pollen sperm mixes with the female ovule, and you end up with a seed. I know you've seen these pine seeds that have these wing-like structures on them. That helps them blow away, and then they can grow into a young seedling plant and eventually an adult. So the female cones kind of look different than the male cones. The male cones are the ones you see with the pollen. Flowering seed plants, those are the angiosperms. So these have flowers, and inside the flower, you're going to see a stamen, which is a male reproductive organ, and it's going to have pollen grains at the tip of the stamen, and those are called anthers. The pistil is the female reproductive part of a flower. So here's a picture that shows you the male and female parts of a flower. So the pistil is all the female reproductive parts, and that contains the stigma, the style, and the ovary with the ovules. So this large structure in the center is the female part of a flower. The male parts are the anther, where the pollen is located, and they're on top of these filaments. So flowers most times have female and male structures. So this picture shows you how flowering plants reproduce. So here's a flower cross-section. Here's your stigma, and it's usually sticky, so it can catch pollen grains. So the male pollen grains will land on the sticky stigma. Now, some flowers can pollinate themselves, or they can get pollen from other sources. And when the pollen mixes with the female structure, that's where a seed will grow. So the pollen will go all the way down to the ovule, and fertilization will happen, where the sperm and the egg join to make a zygote, which is a fertilized egg. An embryo will develop, and then the seeds develop from the ovule. Some flowering plants make the fruit, and the fruit usually has a good taste to attract animals, like people or, birds, dogs even. And so when they eat the good taste in fruit, that's a way for the plants to get the seeds dispersed. So the seed will then sprout if it lands near some good soil, and you get a little seedling plant that will eventually grow into a mature plant. Fruits and seeds are important sources of food, but they're also good for plants because they help them distribute their seeds. Most seeds are inside of a fruit. I'm sure you can think of a fruit like a strawberry, where the seeds are on the outside. An ear of corn is made of many fruits or kernels. The kernel is mostly a seed. There's a picture of strawberries where the seeds are on the outside. So again, fruits are good for us to eat, but they also protect and help distribute the seeds, especially when animals eat the seeds.